Okay, population is the last major chunk of this whole module. It's the shorts discussion is pretty good. It certainly gives you some nice sort of static visuals to look at. When you're looking at population is one of those things that it probably only usually comes up when people are talking about some sort of a crisis one way or the other. But when you really look at it, the major key factor is the term demographics. Demographics just means people on the land or people on the landscape. Now, this goes back to this whole idea of space and region also, because when you're looking at demographics, you're usually using some sort of a bounded area and saying within that bounded area, how many people you have. And then also, subsets of that, male, female, age groups, religious affiliations, whatever it might be, would all be part of demographics. If you want to think about the United States, a lot of this is done by the US Census. Demographics is absolutely critical to running any group, because you have to know where people are, what type of people they are, what they're capable of doing, and all of this has to be within the context of a physical landscape. So population geography is a hugely important part of geography, and there's a ton of geographers that do this type of stuff. A lot of them working for non-governmental organizations, like Oxfam or something like that, but also just for places like the United Nations, and of course the U.S. Census Bureau. I mean, a huge chunk of those folks are geographers. And this is one of those areas where on one hand, you're looking at human geography because it's people on the landscape. On the other hand, a lot of this is very, very statistically driven because you're looking at large numbers of people and you're trying to discern stuff for groups. You're not necessarily interested in a person on the landscape, which is a group of people in what chunk of landscape. So it involves a combination of statistics, physical mapping, and a whole mess of other factors. In some ways, it's probably the most data-driven, or at least one of the most data-driven parts of geography is population studies in one way, shape, or form. And it's a huge part of the discipline. It has been, pretty much forever, because it's always been of interest to governments, which means they're going to pay for it. So, population geography, there's whole programs here at universities, and some universities in the US where they do nothing, but you get a degree, your PhD even in population geography. That's the whole chunk of the discipline. For our purpose, we're going to go over it really quickly. So just remember first, demographics is very straightforward. It is literally the people on the landscape. The trick is you have to parse out, what do you want to know about the people, and how much of the landscape. And of course, that goes back to, you also want to look at this over time. So you want to look at the patterns of people on the landscape and how those have changed. Have people moved in? Have they moved out? Are there more people being born there now than there used to be? Where are they on parts of the landscape? For example, with the hurricane that just hit Louisiana, how many people live on the areas next to rivers or streams that can flood? What are the spatial characteristics of that landscape? If you're trying to evacuate people, how many roads do you have to go out? Where are you going to put those people? Where are they going to evacuate to? And all that, if you don't have your demographics, if you don't know how many people New Orleans has in it, then you sure as hell are not going to be able to figure out what to do to help them, because you're operating in the blind. So governments especially are tremendously concerned about demographics in all sorts of in complicated ways, shapes, and forms that we didn't have time to go into this class, and it's not that pertinent. Though if you want to look at as part of one of your critical thinking papers, feel free. Redistricting, for example, for national politics here in the United States is entirely based on demographics. So one of the key things you're looking at that we tend to see, and this especially as a discussion in the 21st century, is population density. So not only where people are on the landscape, but how many people do you have in a particular piece of the landscape. So for example, Kaka'ako is actually becoming one of the most densely populated sections of the island of Oahu, or in fact, the Hawaiian Islands in general, by virtue of the population density. Why? Because almost the entire population lives in high rises. So if you're looking at like square meter, people per square meter, it's pretty high. One of my favorite areas to hang out is Mong Kok in Hong Kong. And that's been famous for years for being the most densely populated place on the planet, because everything's high rises and you have people living in really tiny apartments, the size of my office, or maybe size of 1/3 your dorm room. So you literally can have, 1,000 people in a high rise, and you've got 20 high rises on a block. So, the population density in Mong Kok is mind blowing. You don't notice it necessarily when you're on the ground. There's a lot of people, there's a lot of stuff going on, but if you actually sit there and look at the numbers, it's pretty freaky. If on the other hand, you go to northern Montana, you'd find you have a population density that's so low that you might have one person per every 5 square kilometers of space. So literally people couldn't see anyone else to actually spread them out evenly. So population density is hugely important. Things like ambulance services, if you're going to do vaccines, where do you put clinics? Well, if you've only got one people for every, square mile, then you're going to have a hard time giving people vaccinations because you just physically can't get to them, or are they going to be able to get to you? If you've got, on the other hand, someplace like Mongkok with maybe, 20,000 people per block, then you've got an entirely different set of issues in terms of, dealing with things like, for example, vaccination. So population density, again, is a key part of this. All these things sort of tier together. They're not really separate. There's two concepts or terms that we use a lot. We're actually, well, we'll get to the third one in a second, but they're just, crude birth rate, which is CBR, usually abbreviated as, and then CDR, which is crude death rate. So this is literally if you're looking at a particular place, say a country. So if you're looking at their numbers, this will usually be parlayed in terms of numbers per 100,000. So if you're looking at the CBR for Japan, the birth rate might be, 0.3 per 100,000. And the death rate might be 0.6 per 100,000. That tells you there's more people dying than are being born. Now, this is a tricky one because crude birth rates don't necessarily tell you a lot because they're just an amalgams. They're sort of statistical collections. They don't tell you, for example, the fine print of like where those births are happening, or how many of those kids live to be a year or 2 or 3 years old, which is a huge area, for example, in Africa and even in parts of Micronesia, where we have very low, very high mortality rates for infants. You might have a very high birth rate, but that doesn't mean you have a lot of people that were born that are still around at 10 years of age, for example. That could be a very different number. So crude birth rate and crude death rates are oftentimes misleading because they make something seem pretty straightforward when it's actually much more, complicated. The key concept you want to remember here is the idea of replacement rate. And this is the idea that in a population, again, we use countries since that's the easiest one to look at. You want to have at least, 10 years from now, you want to have enough kids being born to replace the people that have keeled over. So you want your birth rate to at least match, and in fact, should be slightly higher than your death rate because people are going to die, for all sorts of reasons before they get to be 70 or whatever. So replacement rate is having enough births to cover all your issues and cover the deaths and all the things that happen to people in a society. One of the really striking factors that's occurred in the last half of the 20th century has become a major social political issue in many countries in the 21st century is the fact that replacement rates are dropping. So if you have to have this type of birth rate to match the death rate, what's happened in many societies, it's gone like this. Your replacement rate has now collapsed in the sense the replacement rate is not providing enough kids to replace the old folks, the folks that have keeled over. And let me pause this for a second so I can pull this up. Okay, here we see Japan. Japan's one of the classic examples. In fact, you've got a video that I want you to watch on the issues in rural Japan. And here's what we call a population pyramid. Now, theoretically, if you looked over to the left here, you can see a traditional population pyramid should look like this. You have a lot of kids being born, people die, and various things happen to them, accidents occur, whatever, and the population as you get older and older. So age goes up this way, and your numbers are to the sides. This would be male and female, so male, female. I think I'm not sure which the real thing. But the key here is as you go up, you should get something like this. This is what we call a Malthusian pyramid here. But basically, you're going to get a classic pyramid. So your population should shrink because every year people get older, there's fewer of them around. Now, replacement rate would mean that you pretty much have at least enough, enough at the bottom to handle the emergencies before you get to the top. Now, this is Japan's current, well, this is a couple of years ago, but it's actually, if anything, the bottom's gotten smaller. This is an example of a country that doesn't have replacement rate. So if you visualize, remember your numbers are going this way, your numbers are in the horizontal, and your age is going vertically. What you've got here is a society as folks are getting older. For one, they're living really long. Japanese have the longest lifespan in the world. I believe women now have the average age statistically, I think it's something like 85. So half of Japanese women reach the age of 85, and I think for guys it's 81. So you're only losing that population there. By contrast, I believe in Russia, the average mortality rate ages for women is, I'm just guessing, I'm going to say 70, 71 or 72. And for men, I believe it's about 65. So Japanese men live almost 20 years longer than their Russian counterparts, and Japanese women live almost 20 years longer than their Russian counterparts. Problem is here is if you notice when you go into the younger groups, especially when you go down to say 20 or something here, notice how the numbers are shrinking. So what happened starting about 40 years ago is when Japanese, started to become successful, middle class, etc., is husband and wives, in other words, pairs of individuals, decided to only have one kid instead of two. So what happened is more and more Japanese families either had no kids at all or only had one child. Well, when you think about it, if you've got two adults and one kid, that ain't replacement rate, because you've got two adults here and if they're only generating one child, then you don't have replacement. You only have a 50% replacement. So what happened in Japanese society for social reasons, and to a certain extent also economic, but also largely social, people wanted to move to the cities. City apartments are small. It's a real humbug to have, kids. It's expensive to have kids. If both parents are working, it's hard to deal with kids. Many of you are familiar with all this stuff. So in Japan, as in many societies, what's happened is people just said, well, I want to have a kid, but we really can't afford, and just from a stress, emotional level, we just can't handle two kids, or we don't think we can. And so what happens is right here, the folks here, because notice their parents had a lot of kids. So, if you go back 50 or 60 years, Japanese had 2 or 3 kids per family. And so that meant that you had replacement rate. What has happened since the 1960s is that it's shrunk. And notice how the taper's going this way. So every year there's fewer Japanese of, sort of child production age that are actually having kids. Now, of course, notice at some point now that this has gotten into these are folks in their 20s right here. You've now got folks who are in their 20s who are already, there's fewer of them than there were their parents' generation, and they're still not having as many kids. So this thing starts to accelerate. What this means is this has all sorts of sort of inserting side effects. Among other things, if you're the Japanese educational system, you're not going to need as many elementary schools. Why? Because you don't have as many kids. They're going to be much more concentrated in certain areas, largely cities. You're going to find very few kids in rural areas. It's really creepy if you go to Japan, as I do regularly, and you go in the rural areas, you go to villages and you see no one under the age of 65 or 70 or even 80. You go out in the fields, even near Biwa, for example, just outside of Kyoto, and it looks like I would guess the average age of the folks working in the fields out there is probably in their 80s. I mean, they look like it. And you go through the town, you see 1 or 2, usually women, maybe in their 30s or 40s, but everyone else is really, really old. And there's no kids. And one of the major elementary schools, which was a big school till recently, shut down because there's no one there. Well, that means you don't need a lot of elementary school teachers. And that's also going to, a couple of years, mean you need less high school teachers. And that also means if you're a company, you're going to have a hell of a hard time finding employees as the folks up here retire. And the retirement age in Japan traditionally was 59 to 61 years of age. So if those folks are all retired, which would be right about here, and you're looking for a bunch of new hires who are 20, you're now competing with an ever smaller group of Japanese who are now entering the workforce. And not surprisingly, they're going to be really, really picky about what type of jobs, since there's a bunch of jobs and not many people, versus their parents' generation, where you were lucky if you could find a job. So population pyramids are a real handy visual image, because what they do is they give you a really good idea of the actual sort of parameters that are going on in the society. Now, notice again, this generalizations, hundreds of thousands, etc. Let's pull up another one here. I think they've got one. That's what I was looking for. Oh, here we go. Thanks. Yeah. Now, here's a really interesting one. This is Russia. Russia's a real interesting demographic. If you notice, this pattern doesn't look anything like Japanese. The Japanese looks sort of like a big blob, and then it shapes down. In fact, you can still see it over here. So the Japanese one is a fairly statistically smooth pattern. If you look at this Russian one, it's really odd. It's got all sort of perturbations in and out. One is the fact that the Russians took enormous casualties in World War II, and the population was very slow to recover. On top of that, Russia itself, what is currently Russia, doesn't include a lot of what was the Soviet Union until 1989. And in the existing Russia, almost all of the population growth has been in what would be termed minorities, except in a lot of Russia, they're not minorities, they're the majority. On top of that, Russia has enormous problems with both alcoholism and also with drugs, but especially alcoholism. Alcoholism is almost incipient in Russia for folks over the age of 10. it would be very typical if you're a sixth grade teacher, for example, in a Russian school, to have maybe 20 to 40% of your students are already alcoholics. If you think about it, it's a surreal concept even by American standards, but it's real typical of the enormous problem in Russia with all this. So you've got all these factors basically working against things. And what that means is on one hand, you might have, a pretty significantly large population in, say, the range of 20 to 40 years of age. But if you think about it, if a large chunk, especially the guys here, I'm pretty sure that must be the guys. If the guys over here, if you've got maybe 40% of the population between 20 and 40 has been alcoholic since they were 10, those of you in nursing or something like that can visualize what that means to their livers. So not only these folks are going to have a hard time holding and keeping a job just because they can't function effectively in many ways, but also physically, they're basically killing themselves. They're poisoning themselves, because we're not talking alcoholism like a couple of Bud Lights. We're talking alcoholism like the norm in Russia is pretty much one bottle of vodka a day. And we're talking in many cases homemade vodka, so it's got very high ethyl alcohol levels. In many cases, it would, if you were to drink a fair amount of it, probably would kill you. It literally would just zap you. You get cirrhosis of the liver so fast you wouldn't know what hit you. So what you've got here is a population when they get older, they are in many ways pretty incapacitated. They've got all sorts of physical ailments that are shown up by virtue of earlier behavior. And so the population up here, unlike their Japanese counterparts who tend to be incredibly healthy, which is one reason why the Japanese live so much longer at this upper end. But this population up here, there's a fairly large number. But what it doesn't tell you is how many of these need to require hospitalization, how many need dialysis, how many are on the borderline of keeling over. So there's enormous cost in the population. Now, if you notice, you also have this tremendous perturbation here. So you also have periods in time, and this again is happening again in Russia, the number of people having kids is dropping off radically. And so the whole population is shrinking very quickly. And a lot of this doesn't take very long. So again, just because they're so easy to do visually. China is a fascinating case in point, because if you're all familiar with China, till about 10 years ago, they had one child policy because China had such a huge part of the total world's population, and they were limited in the resources. They basically thought they were going to eat themselves out of the country. And so what they did is in the 1960s, they actually regulated and tried to basically push that you could only have one kid. And there are all sorts of financial and social, impacts if you decide you're going to have two. So most people didn't. So they were able to actually control their population growth. And what you see here, this little, sorry, it's fairly small. What you see here is again, between the enormous impacts of just, basically ongoing civil war since the 1890s. Well, actually, basically the 1790s. But especially the enormous death toll in World War II. People's Republic comes to power, and then continuing enormous death tolls right into the 1960s. Huge chunk of the Chinese population gets wiped out. And you basically have no effective healthcare in China till the 1970s. So what you basically have is you have the classic tip of the pyramid, looks like a real typical sort of what you might call human pyramid if you don't have modern technology. And you have, classic stereotype warfare. So this part looks very much like what you'd expect to see, in sort of, technology avoidance type situation. If you notice here, then all of a sudden, once mortality rates, especially for infants, start to drop off and stuff like that, then your population increases. And this is where the panic was the idea that you're going to get the population going out like this. China puts a halt to it, and then this all sort of stops. Now, there's an aspect of that is that your minorities in China didn't have the same rules. So minorities in China could have two kids, but they're a really small part of the population total. By the 1980s, 1990s, when China started to become middle class and more successful, what happened is more and more Chinese were moving to the cities, more and more Chinese were making more money. And so what happened is just like their American or Japanese or other counterparts, they started looking around and saying, oh man, I'm not sure if I want two kids. So many Chinese just decide not to have any kids at all because they're only supposed to have one. So what happened very quickly is also the demographics in China changed. And so what happened is all of a sudden here you can see people deciding not to have kids at all. And so what happened is the population suddenly, if you notice here, just went whoop and just cut in. And so China ended up in the really weird situation about 10 years ago when they suddenly realized that they were still patting themselves in the back that they'd kept the population pyramid from going out. And someone finally pointed out to them, I'm sure it was a geographer somewhere, that, dude, you might have solved that problem, but now you've got the reverse problem, just like Japan, South Korea, and a bunch of other places. You don't have enough kids. You don't have replacement anymore for the big chunk of these people get older and they move up that age pyramid. you don't have as large of a workforce replacing them. And this has all sorts of implications, from social services to hospitals to salaries that are paying for social services, all this type of stuff. You don't have the bodies. And it's all of a sudden, about 5 years ago, the Chinese started a public relations campaign to get people to not only have kids, but to have 2 kids, which is ironic given what they were telling folks 40, 50 years earlier. And now, as of this last year, China's actually started to provide financial incentives to have a second kid. So it's literally a 180-degree flip from where they were, 40 or 50 years ago. Now they're trying to get people to have children because they're looking at real problems demographically over time. And you can see they've had some success with that. People are starting to have more kids, but it keeps on going back and forth because people did what the government wanted them to initially, and then people start looking around and going like, oh man, 2 kids are a drain. Look at my sister, she's got 2 kids, and they can't do anything. So no, we're just going to stop at one, or I don't want any kids. So what you get is the Chinese have basically found themselves on the flip of this whole sort of scenario, because they just don't have, the government keeps on changing what it wants because the demographic changes are so impacting. But notice how hard it would be to plan what you need. How many elementary schools do you need, for example? How many hospitals do you need? And because that's going to be changing radically over time when you look at your total population.